All right, we are live again. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Olga Bolotina, and I'm welcoming you to In the Know. Yet another week, and we have a wonderful guest today who I'm excited to present to all of you and have a conversation. And I hope you find this conversation fascinating because person who I'm about to introduce to you and Edminster, we met at the conference, and I've been already blown away by not only her background and her expertise in so many areas, but also by her just human kindness and compassion and understanding. We had a little bit of a scheduling things, and she was just nothing but kind and absolutely patient. So I cannot wait to talk not only about professional things that Anne is doing, but also about how she is managing to stay balanced and present and kind in the midst of the pandemic and all of the other things that are going on. So, Anne, thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to read the introduction, and my cat seems to be wanting to help me here. So bear with us. That's part
Mine
of
also
being
does
doing
too.
things at home and on Zoom, right? It's like your partner's furry too want to chime in, apparently. Oh well, uh, we'll just roll with the punches. So, and Edminster with M.Arch is an international expert on sustainable homes and communities and authored Energy Free, which is Home for a Small Planet, an award winning guide to designing and building zero energy, zero emissions homes. She has served in leadership and subject matter expert roles for the US, Canada, Mexico Commission for International Cooperation, US Green Building Council, Canada Green Building Council, American Institute for Architects, and numerous other prominent organizations and clients. Those are extremely prominent. I cannot wait to talk about those. She consults on zero emission initiatives throughout Northern America, and we touched a little bit on the project that she is working in right now. I'm excited also to hear a little bit more about it. Now I have fur flying everywhere. And Anne is collaborating also, which is I find very interesting, with building professionals, nonprofit organizations, public agencies, research institutions, utilities, supply chain clients, investors, and homeowners to create leading edge projects and advocate for people and planet friendly building solutions at all scales. So, wow, exciting. So and anyway, yeah, no, it's very you not only have very diverse expertise and experience within sort of the layers of society, meaning nonprofits and public sector and business, but also internationally, which is very compelling. I think something that brings very unique perspective, perhaps. So, but I always want to step back a little bit and sort of go to origins. Where did you grow up, and what your upbringing, your parents, your environment had to do with who you are today and your choices in life. I know, small question, right?
I was going to say that covers a lot of territory. I actually grew up in Pacifica, California, which is just south of San Francisco on the coast. And both my parents were teachers by profession, although my mother stepped away from teaching when my brother and I were born because that's what you did in those days. And she went back to teaching when we were in our middle school years. They were both English teachers, which definitely has had an influence in my life. I am a writer, among other things, and I find myself teaching. In fact, a funny story, many years ago now, probably 20 plus years ago, someone asked me about my family, and I was telling about my family and sort of recounting what everyone did. And I said, well, everyone in my family except me is a teacher. And then I stopped and I went, oh, wait, that used to be true, but actually now I'm also teaching. So it catches up with you, these things. And let's see, what else about my growing up? Well, some of the things, I think both parents being teachers, and they were both very socially and politically active. And that was definitely an influence. My dad actually was, I think at one point, a member of the Communist Party, which was, horrifying in those days, right?
Whoa.
Scandalous, right? When I grew up, they were just garden variety Democrats, but very socially conscious. My mom, although she taught English occupationally, her initial college degree was in sociology, and she was very concerned with social welfare and did tons of volunteering and all kinds of local organizations when I was a kid. So, and I grew up participating in civil rights marches and women's rights marches and farm worker rights and anti-war demonstrations. I helped clean up birds who had been fouled with oil from the big spill off of Santa Barbara in the late 70s. So yeah, these were all definitely a part of sort of what made me me. I think another part of my youth that was really important, and I'm sorry it's not still a part of my life, but in my teens and 20s, I did a lot of backpacking in the High Sierra wilderness areas and just, developed a real appreciation for the wilderness. So I think those, all of that's just a part of me. Oh yeah, and one other little piece that often comes up in these environmental context conversations. I was one of the first volunteers at our local recycling facility when I was about 10 years old.
Oh, wow. I wonder what it was like back then.
Oh, it was pretty crude. I think we had some steel containers, and people would show up with their brown paper sacks full of bottles, which we would gleefully heave into the bin. And that was about it. Cans and bottles. It was pretty simple, and all volunteers at that point. So we're talking more than half a century ago. So.
And where was it?
In Pacifica, California.
In Pacifica.
The San Mateo County coast.
Yeah. We talked a little bit about Pacifica just now. Wow, that's fascinating. One thing that I cannot not comment about, you mentioned Communist Party, of course. I grew up in Russia. My father could not be in Communist Party if he wanted to A, stay in his job, and B, have any kind of, aspirations for promotions or travels or anything like that. It was just not even a possibility, and of course, I was born in 75. So my parents, 23, 25 years older. So they definitely got, to be in that era of communist socialism, which of course, my sort of always point that I try to make as much as I can. I mean, those labels that we put are just that. They're labels: communist, socialism, capitalism. It really is, we never had socialism or capitalism. We always had dictatorships, really. I mean, the closest I think we're coming to socialistic society is probably, European countries at this point, when they have, some of them have, good balances of social services, and also businesses where everybody sort of feels some level of support. But in Russia, it never was true communism. It was sort of forceful, forceful. And I was a pioneer and aspiring to be a communist, but it's interesting, indoctrination, how it works, firsthand, only experience. Yeah. But and teacher, you mentioned, the teacher, and interesting, you mentioned also that you are involved in teaching now. So the transitions, right? So maybe we should jump into that, because the project that you mentioned, that you're working with 3 counties, is fascinating and has all of those aspects. So what are you finding? What makes you interested in this project? And maybe you can just outline it a little bit for everybody.
Sure. Yeah, so the project is, I'm working with what's called 3C Ren. It's a we live in a world of acronyms. Tri-County Regional Energy Network. The three counties in question are San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, and Ventura. So the center part of the state, or coastal center part of the state. And the regional energy networks, we have three in California. There's the Northern California, Central, and Southern. And what they do is collaborate, bring together resources to develop programs that will advance essentially energy efficiency, code compliance, and so forth within their respective regions, because these are agendas that are of mutual interest sort of across the individual jurisdictions. And so it's much more efficient to do them at the regional scale. I've also done a fair amount of work with the Bay Area Regional Energy Network. So I'm working with the 3CRAN to help them further develop their program of educational offerings primarily for building professionals and other stakeholders that interact with the building industry ecosystem. And we're also going to start to look at the opportunities, that's sort of the supply side in effect of the energy efficiency business, if you will. And we're also going to start to look at engaging the demand side, which is, of course, building owners, homeowners, and tenants in that, and sort of see if we can start to cultivate some interest in that. So it's not always some poor, building performance professional trying to sell a service, say, that a homeowner's never heard of and has no idea why they should care about. And, what's interesting about this work to me is that it's all about awareness. And I was on a conversation with some friends and colleagues a couple of nights ago, and one of them commented that so much of what shapes our culture is the information that we get or don't get, the quality of that information. And so I feel that it's very important, that we make good information available, make it available in a way that's accessible, appealing, inspiring, accurate, of course, but people also have to know that it's available to them. And so there's also this whole question of, if we have great information and we know there's an audience that will benefit by it, it does us no good if that audience isn't aware of the offering or has a notion that it's got value to them. So we have to look at that whole picture. One thing, every so often, every few years, I guess, maybe 2, 3, 5 years or something, I'll have one of these big aha moments. And one of them, probably 10 years or so ago now, was around education. And I had been talking to a colleague who was involved in the US Department of Energy's Building Better Neighborhoods program, and speaking to her about her experience of that program and some of the things that she had learned from it. And she said, well, really the core takeaway for her was that you needed not just information, but inspiration. And that really stuck for me. And I thought, that's really what education is. It's both information and inspiration together, because one without the other really doesn't stick, right? And a little later, I had another sort of further idea from that, which is, we often think or speak of education as though it's something that we can give, right? We're providing education, but really education is something that people acquire, right? They have to be interested and motivated in order to acquire an education. We can make programs available, but we can't actually, I can't educate you, right? You can only educate yourself if I create an environment where I can inform and inspire. And so that's kind of the framework that I try to work in around it, in the field of education, and just making the information available, providing the inspiration. hopefully.
Well, touching on something that I am extremely interested in, and sort of a couple of thoughts on that. Education is, it was sort of use this word education like this is the important thing. I mean, it's really important what you are teaching people also, because you can teach things that are, and we've been traditionally teaching things that are not sustainable, talking about building professionals and planners. And I'm not an engineer. I come from family. Both of my parents are engineers, so sometimes I joke that they sort of absorbed shipbuilding engineers. Actually, my mom became a teacher because she was more sort of a person, very outgoing person. So but education is important, and just today I heard a phrase that I was like, wow, that resonates. Sometimes education, especially if in a personal development, or is like becomes an entertainment, and it's like something that I was sending to people yesterday. Zig Ziglar, I don't know if you heard of them, but he said repetition is the mother of learning, the father of action, which makes it the architect of accomplishment. I'm like, you know what? This is so true, actually. So yes, there's education, there's motivation, and there's a repetition. And to me, it resonates in so many ways. I also started looking into behavioral changes and what actually sparks behavioral changes.
Uh-huh.
And it is repetition. It's tapping into emotional connection, what motivates you on emotional level, not necessarily on the cognitive level, but also repetition. That's why corporations are so successful, because all the advertisement we see, it's repetition.
That's right.
From different angles in different ways, visual, auditory, tactile sometimes. So anyway, so
Right.
I'm constantly, that's my quest. How can we bring those things that corporations investing enormous amount of money to come up with those strategies into sustainability field, and tap into, sort of make this serve for good, our own psychology is sort of,
Yeah.
So what are the lessons that what do you see? Because, building professionals and planners, I think that, I have huge respect for them. And at the same time, I think there's a certain sort of, we taught in certain ways, and it's difficult to shift from operating this way to something new. So what are you finding that is most sort of effective and useful in your work with, transforming the building and energy sector?
Well, I have another story about that, sort of what another aha moment, if you will, or two. One of the things that I did in my career, I guess, chunk of my career, I spent chairing the development of LEED for homes for the U.S. Green Building Council. And in that role, I traveled around the country a lot, and I talked to many green building pioneers and to learn from them. And one of the things that I realized at a certain point, after talking to, I don't know, how many scores or even hundreds of people involved in the early work, I realized that every single one of them had said, I just decided I had to do this. And I figured out the business part later. And I thought, wow, that's really powerful. I mean, not one exception to that. So that was really very enlightening to me, that this always came from a position of commitment. And then a little while later, years later, eventually I thought, well, wait a minute. So before they reached that moment where they decided, I need to do this, they obviously had a different mindset. So I started to ask, well, what changed? What flipped that switch? And I was having that conversation with a colleague of mine at one point, Bob Berkebile, who's really a wonderful, wonderful elder and role model in the field of green architecture. And I was telling Bob about this, and I said, so what is your thought about this? And he said, well, what I find is when I tell my story of what converted me, that often moves people. So, Olga, when you just spoke about that, what moves people, what's the emotional response? That's what I got from Bob. And I thought, I haven't, been able to go back to those same hundreds of green building pioneers and ask them, is that what happened for you? Did you hear someone else's story? But I have shared that with a number of people since then. And many of them find that really resonates for them. And so that's something that I try to share with people. And in a lot of the classes I teach and talks that I do, I tell people one of the most important things you can do is wear your heart on your sleeve, right? It's like, tell them why you do what you do, that you do it for your children or your grandchildren, or for the disappearing species to halt the sixth mass extinction, because people will be moved by that. And in many ways, I think that's the glue that makes, again, the information stick, right? Because you can open your mouth and, there's that I see your lips moving, but I don't hear you phenomenon. But providing something that people connect to and connect to you as a person is the most important thing, really. And what I do often too in classes, I make people laugh. I'm silly. I can't not be silly. It's just not in my character. And the other thing is, I tell people, I guarantee at least one rant in every class.
Well, you already heard me going on the rant, so that's not a problem.
Yeah, it's like somebody will ask a question and they'll be like, "Oh, I'm so glad you asked." It's like it'll hit some sort of pet peeve of mine or something. It always happens, and it's the most fun part of it.
It's true, but you know what? I think that I'm observing a lot of its sort of significance versus humbleness and sort of authenticity. I think a lot of people are afraid to be themselves because we live in such a cerebral sort of world that if you do show that sort of human part, which it's not even a human part. I mean, I am also, one of my pet peeves is like this sort of segregation in terms of, oh, this is my work, this is me, and the personal life, it's just all one me. Yes, there's different aspects to me that I'm bringing in different situations out, and it's normal, but I really was like, we need to get away with it. Nature does not have that separation and borders, and we incline to do, oh, the doctor is treating this, whatever. I'm on a tangent here, but anyway, I think more we think holistically and sort of understand that really everything is connected. I think that I just watched a fabulous movie, very bizarre. I love Huckabee, I think. I love Huckabee. I don't know. I need to put it in the comments at some point because it was a bizarre movie, but very interesting. All about, sort of interconnectedness, holistic approach, etc.
Sounds interesting.
But it was very. I warn everybody. It's very bizarre, but anyway, but it makes it interesting too. But you know what? I realized I didn't even ask you where this interest in green building, because green building is actually a big interest of mine, because not only that buildings produce so much emissions, but also because I think that we live in buildings and it just creates so much of our surrounding, our environment, and how they design, how they construct it has a huge impact. But what brought you that interest? Why did you decide to get into the buildings and construction and design? What is do you have official education, or you just interested?
It's a little bit of a mystery. So as I said, both my parents are English teachers. Most of my family are teachers. They're mostly involved in sort of liberal arts and so forth. So I was a little bit of an anomaly in my family, being more of a math science kind of person, although I also have this sort of arty side. And somewhere, the funny part is I got a degree in architecture, both a bachelor's and a master's eventually. And people would ask me, it's like, oh, well, how did you choose architecture? I say, I don't actually remember how I arrived at that choice. I just remember that after the fact, I sort of rationalized it by saying it was sort of where my artistic side intersected with my math science side. So that's sort of how I ended up in architecture. A little, again, mystifying to me to this day. But once in the architecture field, I mentioned my early experience with waste management, and waste, I've always just hated waste. It's just, I was born that way. And so seeing the waste in the building industry just made me crazy. And so there really wasn't anything going on about green building when I was in college. I think there were beginnings of things like passive solar happening, but I somehow missed them. They didn't cross my horizon until probably the late 80s. So a good 10 years after I was out of college. And it took a while before it to really, coalesced into much. First, there was some stuff about waste, and there was a little bit about sick building syndrome. And
What is that? What is the sick building syndrome?
sick building syndrome was something, a label applied to some very serious indoor air quality problems that arose. Again, I would say probably sometime in the 80s, and was a notable issue in some commercial buildings where people became very ill because of the mechanical, heating, ventilating, and air conditioning systems being contaminated. So that started to be a dialogue. And then there was also some early, there were some publications, one called Shelter, that started to really share some early kind of back to the land, and people doing what are now called tiny houses and little cabins. And so anyway, there were a number of these little bits of what I would call the seeds of green building that started to pop up. And that eventually got me back to graduate school. So I went back, I did my master's at UC Berkeley from 93 to 95 when I was well into my career. And it was a real pivotal point for me. And when I went in, there was nothing resembling green building program, but I basically knew that as a, mature practitioner, the only way I was really gonna make a left turn in my career, for me, was gonna, again, delve into education, right? It was definitely a pivotal thing for me to go back to school. And I really kind of crafted my own program while I was there. I was lucky enough that there was some really strong faculty in the building science and energy efficiency field. And so I did a lot of work with them. And there was one faculty member, Cassandra Adams, who was starting to pioneer in green materials. And so those two, energy, materials, and residential architecture, were kind of my three focus areas. I've never been a fan of big buildings. I'm not interested in institutional buildings, really. I mean, I can admire some colleagues' work in those areas, but for me, it's always been interested in how people live. So that's kind of the story. It was kind of the environmental ethos that I brought to my career, that sort of predated my career in effect, and eventually permeated it, and found the opportunity to weave them together.
That's fascinating. I'm actually curious to your opinion. Just for some reason, I had a lot of conversations lately about work in municipalities. Also, you cannot get away with as a council member on the Community Economic Development Committee, which deals with construction and planning and zoning. And I'm curious from your perspective, the sort of the LEED in green building, which, California has green building certification and LEED certification, versus sort of a green building, in the sense that, you look at the LEED buildings sometimes and they look like cement boxes, honestly. Just not very appealing. And you look also at some buildings, I think in Thailand, or, the beautiful elaborate building that incorporates the greenery and sort of really pivot the building to account for the winds and for the sun. And so can you talk a little bit about sort of the next step beyond LEED, beyond green certification, just for energy consumption, so to speak, or energy efficiency? Anything that you?
Oh my goodness, yeah. There's so much to be said there, and in fact, after we got the LEED for Homes program launched, that's when I sort of said, okay, what's next? I think an underlying theme for my career trajectory has been always, okay, where's the next big lever? Right. And so after LEED for Homes, that question, or the answer to that question for me, was net zero energy. Because among other things, I was very disappointed that the U.S. Green Building Council was not moving far enough on energy and climate, far enough, fast enough. And, they had said, oh, we're going to do carbon accounting. And 10 years later, it still hadn't happened. It now is happening, but it's just been very slow. And I wasn't interested in waiting around. So that's when I wrote Energy Free Homes for a Small Planet, which was the first book on zero energy homes. And I'm actually theoretically writing a sequel, which would be emissions free, or carbon free, actually, Homes for a Small Planet, because, honestly, from the beginning, in my concern with energy, it's always been a proxy for emissions, right? It's not that they're exactly equal, but there's this, of course, intimate relationship between the two. And so I'm so excited at the direction now in California and elsewhere on decarbonization, electrification, and I'm, up to my eyeballs in all that stuff right now. And I just couldn't be more thrilled that we are finally focusing there. And interestingly enough, I actually did my master's thesis with a very strong focus on embodied carbon. Again, in those days, it was embodied energy as a proxy for embodied carbon. And there was very little attention to that then. At the time, the thinking was, well, sure, embodied emissions matter, but because it's relatively small piece of the overall footprint of the building over its lifespan, it's like, let's not worry so much about that. We're focused on operating emissions.
And can you say a little bit more about embodied emissions versus operation emissions? So
Sure.
Yeah. I'm not going to pretend I'm not an engineer, so I'm not green building certified or LEED certified, so I can use some brush up on this information.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so operating emissions essentially are the emissions created through the use of energy while a building is operating. So to heat it, cool it, run all the electrical devices and so forth. The embodied emissions are the emissions associated with the creation of the building. So it goes all the way back to resource extraction, mining, drilling, et cetera, and then transport, refining, manufacture, more transport, and then all the energy entailed in the construction process itself. So heavy machinery, down to nail guns, drills, and so forth. So it's basically all that it takes to make that building come from its, state of raw materials in the ground to being a completed structure. So, and again, the thinking a couple decades ago was, well, the embodied emissions are maybe 10, 15 or so % of the overall emissions. No big deal, right? Well,
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, when we now have a decade in which to turn around the climate change engine, people are
Mhm.
going, oh, wait, but those 10 to 15% of emissions all take place. It's a front end load, right? And so
Mhm.
if we're looking at a building through a 10-year lens, all of a
Mhm.
sudden those emissions might represent 60 or 80% of the
Yeah.
emissions in that 10-year time frame. So it's also been wonderful and gratifying and exciting to see there's a lot of attention on embodied emissions now, finally, a quarter
Yeah.
century later.
Well, I'm also excited to talk about it, because excited and terrified, honestly. It's a combination, because to me, I'm very curious about life cycle analysis, and life cycle analysis because I feel that, we get a product, but very few of us really understand the origins of all the materials. And I keep something that I'm repeating, but it's true. It's like not only emissions, but ecosystems that probably UN report from 2 years ago that is devastating loss of ecosystems and biodiversity, which is, of course, anybody who knows about how the world operates on the physiological, sort of biological level should be terrified by that. But also, cruelty factor, how people are treated, in different countries. Something that stuck with me in terms of the building construction. I read an article a while back, actually, about how this. I mean, we use a lot of sand in construction, correct, to make cement and stuff. And how sand is mined is horrific. That the rivers are dredged completely. So it's like when those factors that go into the building construction, some of them are horrifying, quite
Yeah,
frankly. So I think
it's really,
accounting, not
yeah.
just, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say it's a devastating industry, really, when you come down to it. You mentioned the cell phone and the associated impacts. Another pioneer in our field, Ray Anderson, who was the head of interface
Mhm,
engineering, made carpet. I
mhm,
heard
mhm,
Ray speak probably again 20 plus years ago. And at the time, he was sharing a factoid that he'd hold up. He said this a 4 pound laptop that was, lightweight in those days. A 4 pound
mhm,
laptop represented 4,000 pounds of raw materials extraction. And, all of
mhm.
again, the devastation associated with that. So, yeah, we have literally when we look at a little device like this, it is the tip of the iceberg. And, you mentioned so many of our buildings are really quite soulless and, made with very carbon intensive materials. You
Mhm.
might find it entertaining to know that I just finished writing a chapter for a new book that's in progress that a couple of my colleagues are crowdsourcing, in effect, from a community of a dozen or two or three dozen
Mhm.
of us who are active in this field. And my chapter, it's largely about carbon sequestering materials, but my chapter
Mhm.
is essentially a manifesto to say, let's just stop building all of this
Mhm.
because we don't need most of it. Really, all we need is decent housing for people who don't have it. And by the way, we've got a lot of empty buildings right now.
Mhm.
So we can house those people. That's really all we should be doing right now in terms of construction. We can't afford to
Yeah.
do any of the rest of it by any measure. It's crazy.
Yeah. Well, of course, if you go to HUD and all of the housing, and it's like now we're facing homeless crisis, and build. But you're absolutely right. We have so many empty buildings that people are holding on to for whatever reasons. I don't want to get into the, tax and et cetera. But it's definitely worthwhile looking into both. Where can we we decrease things and use the supply that we already have? One of the things, I mean, it's not in our country, it's in China. I saw also a documentary once. There are all those ghost towns that construction, huge building is standing empty when they were trying to bring people from villages into the city, and it's just devastating on its own. But literally they have like ghost towns with 12, 16 story buildings that are absolutely empty in the middle of nowhere. It was devastating. But that the housing especially now is just such a hot topic that I don't know if you and I want to get into it, because that might
That's a big rabbit hole.
Sparks. It's a rabbit hole that spark a lot of the bottom line. People need housing. People need to live in a decent conditions, and people, both rental housing and own housing needs to be up to standards, and people need to have roof over their heads. If they choose so. Again, I think that also, because of my line of work, and we having those conversations about, even when you talk with homeless people, it's not like it's a homogeneous society. You need to talk to individual and see what they want and what their desires are.
Right.
So anyway, that's a separate topic.
Yeah.
For another day, probably.
Yeah, we could talk about that for a long time.
Yeah, I want to touch a little bit though on your international work, because how exciting that you got to work within this whole continent basically. So any sort of exciting moments there, and how you bring the experience from your international work to your local work?
That's a great question. The work that I did with the Commission for Environmental Cooperation was really, really fun and gratifying. That was about a 5-year stint where I chaired the Green Building Task Force for the other CEC. Those of us in California think CEC is the California Energy Commission, and it's also the Tri-National Commission for Environmental Cooperation. And that was a really funny story how I got involved in that too. I was just sitting at my desk minding my business one day, and I got a phone call from this gentleman whom I didn't know, saying, "Hello, my name is Benjamin Teitelbaum, and I'm with the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, and would you like to be on our Green Task Force?" And I was kind of like, "Who are you?"
Wow.
Like, well, where did you get my name? Anyway, I still to this day don't know how he got my name, but the way the commission works is the 3 federal governments, I guess, decide on issues of mutual interest to all 3 of them, and then they establish projects which they pursue for a period of years, usually like 2 or 3 year stint. And at that time, they were all very interested in green building, and each had provided names they'd gotten from somewhere. So I was somehow luckily ended up in that bucket. And it was a really a wonderful experience, because there were team members from all 3 countries, from Canada, the US, and Mexico. And it enabled me to learn quite a bit about what was happening in both the other countries, and to sort of bring that together. And what we did during that period was produce a number of what I think are very high value deliverables for the federal governments. One was framed as a cookbook, which is very cool, for development of green building programs by municipalities, and included several case studies of individual local governments and what were being done there. At this point, I don't remember. New York was one of them. I think perhaps Alexandria, Virginia, and 2 or 3 other communities were highlighted. And then it was also presented as, here are some of the most effective elements of different programs. So the ingredients, if you will, and then the recipes were kind of how they tended to be assembled as programs. So that was one deliverable that I was really very pleased with. We also developed a policy. Well, that was sort of the policy piece. I wish I had that whole list at my fingertips because they were terrific. The last one, and in some ways my favorite, was a guide to integrated design and delivery of building projects. And integrated design and delivery, by the way, is the exception, not the norm to the way projects are delivered. But in the green building community, what's been learned is that when an integrated approach is taken, it's much easier to achieve higher performance objectives for the projects. And by integrated, what we mean is bringing together the different disciplines much early in a much more coordinated, communicative, collaborative way, whereas a more typical process is what I call a sequential handoff, kind of a bucket brigade of each discipline sort of taking on their scope in sequence after the others. And so this integrative design guide that we created not only laid out the process, but also articulated the opportunities for engagement based on the role of the stakeholder, whether it was the owner, the developer, the architect, the general contractor, one of the trades, a local community member, and so forth. So that no matter what role you played in the development process, you could say, oh, that's what that role looks like in this integrated framework. And that, of course, everything that was done by the commission is published in all three languages, French, Spanish, and English. So that's quite nice. And they're all available on their website. The links can be hard to find. I think the more disappointing part was that they did a wonderful job of bringing together these across, border teams, and not as good a job at the promotion. So I talked earlier about the importance of people knowing the information is there. It's I often provide links to these tools, but they're not nearly as widely used as I wish they were. So that's a little lesson learned. But definitely understanding what the practices, how the practices differ from, countries in the same continent has been an important lesson learned. And I've also had a little bit of opportunity to engage with colleagues off this continent as well and see some of those differences too.
Well, it's interesting that you're talking about this. Like I'm having my own aha moments. When you were talking about aha moments, I feel like I have those periods of times. And I think when I'm talking with people, I'm like, this is aha moment. This is aha moment. Sometimes they just keep coming, Sometimes I'm looking for them. But, something that occurred to me that United States is kind of in between, obviously, but Canada and Mexico might have very different approaches and very different needs in terms of, Canada, I'm very simplifying it. Canada might need, heat the buildings, Mexico needs to cool the buildings type of thing, So I almost feel like there should be, and something that I'm really concentrating more and more lately on, because I'm also very present to my sort of limited time on this planet. I was like, how can I make things more efficient in a sense, not for the sake of sort of simplifying approaches or consolidating some of the data, some of the learning experiences that we have in a way that people, it's easy for them to access and understand and implement. And something has just occurred to me is like, maybe we should have like a one place, and maybe there is already, maybe you already know about the place where data like that is consolidated in a very searchable, very easy format. I'll give you an example. When you look at the flower books or bird books, they break it down by color of the bird. So you don't. It's like a white bird in North America, and you open and you can look at the birds. So it's sort of like that. You need some kind of database where people, when they don't know what they're looking for, still can find it, so to speak, and maybe do it by zones where again, as I said, southern countries probably need very different approaches than northern countries, etc. So just a
Yeah.
little thought. Maybe
Well,
there is a database like that. Uh-huh.
well, there are actually a number of resources. And in fact, that's reminded me that another one of the deliverables we created with cec.org was, in fact, a green building library, online library and repository. And another one of the lessons learned in that process was um, you need to have someone create the library who has good insight into how users might need to find the information, how they think about what it is they need. And I think they could have done a better job with that, quite frankly. But the bigger challenge, and this has come up actually in the context of a number of projects and organizations I've worked with over the years, and that is maintaining something like that it's an almost impossible task. It's very, very difficult. So the Department of Energy does a pretty good job, interestingly enough. This is where our federal tax dollars are sometimes and somewhat well spent. There's eere.gov, a lot of information there that's very valuable. Also, NREL, NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory.gov has tremendous amount of useful information. The Department of Energy's Zero Energy Ready Home program has a building solution center that's got a lot of great information. And another organization that I've worked with for many years called TeamZero.org also has a central repository on sort of all things zero. And the way that project has been developed and curated is really, it's almost more of a central switchboard, if you will, where essentially we're saying there are all these other organizations who work in this ecosystem, and here's where you'll find information about this and that and the other, and pointing out to those other organizations. And so what you end up with is more of a network of nodes, and the individual nodes are responsible for curating their own information, but we're just trying to pull all the nodes together. And I think that's the best model for that, because otherwise there's too much for anyone to sort of keep a handle on. And especially all of these organizations tend to be under-resourced, can barely manage their own stuff, let alone try to, maintain live links to things in other people's domains. It's just ridiculous. So anyway, it would be great if there were more of those things, but it's hard.
Well, it's a combination of using somebody else's information, which is already out there. But also, I think there's a big desire in all of us to create something of our own. So how do you balance those two and not reinvent the wheel constantly, but also, express your creativity? I think that's another psychological thing that we could. But you know what? I want to touch on your books because clearly it's your passion. So do you have a book that you already wrote in front of you that you can show us? Or
I can grab it fairly quickly.
Yeah.
Well, here's two.
I was commenting earlier how many books you do have on your shelves, and this is awesome.
Yeah, they're not mostly mine, but a few. So this is, I guess, sort of my big one. Here we get it, the whole cover. This is out of print. I have the last few copies of this, and that's why there's a little bit of pressure to, I think, very hot bestseller. I think I sold 8,000 copies.
Wow, congratulations.
So, thank you. Yeah, it was
when did you write it?
Yeah, 2009.
2009. You should reprint more copies.
Well,
on sustainable paper. I think now
it needs to be updated, and that's what's held me back. Okay. I did do one reprinting, and then this was my earlier publication. This I wrote for the Natural Resources Defense Council in 1990. I believe. And I've had some of my colleagues jokingly say that this is a cult classic. The title's way too long. Efficient Wood Use in Residential Construction, a practical guide to saving wood, money, and forests. So this one, since it's now more than 20 years old, oh my God, I can't hardly believe that. It has a lot of resource listings, of course, without URLs. And or if there are, they're out of date. But interestingly enough, the basic principles in this one are still very solid. And then a couple of years ago, I wrote a chapter in this book. This is a treatise that's effectively warning against the carbon issues with tall buildings. I told you I don't like tall buildings very much. So those just a few. I've got chapters in several other books and editorial contributions elsewhere, but I'm overdue for the next one of my own.
Well, I'm looking forward to learning, and it's like the tall buildings. I have to say, and it's like I grew up in a tall building in Russia, in a small apartment. Well, small by American standards, and to us it was big. But I have to say, this also tension between a lot of people wanting their single family home, and preferably with some open space, and also the number of people on the planet. I mean, we really cannot. So infill development and build tall buildings, I have to say, I personally advocate for them, because I want open space and forests to be left alone and pristine.
Well, there's tall, right there, and I think that's the important thing. The question that I raised in this chapter is, how tall is too tall? Because when you get buildings beyond a certain point, you have a smaller and smaller fraction of usable floor plate. There's an inordinate energy burden posed by vertical transportation, and the structure is increasingly embodied carbon heavy. So the research that I've done suggests that the sweet spot between low and sprawling, which also is not desirable, and too tall is probably somewhere around 4 to 6 to 12 stories. So I'm definitely not an advocate for lots of single family sprawl. Definitely not. But it's the uber tall that worries me because of the carbon footprint associated. And also, when we continue to develop hyper tall buildings within urban centers that are already served by mass transit, we're basically just creating more traffic congestion and more vehicle emissions too, because people have to get to those buildings and from them, and our transit systems are already overtaxed when we build them in those settings. So it's all about context.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad we actually touched on that, because I think that I'm glad you mentioned that. It makes a lot of sense, and also so much work to be done yet, right? And creating all of those systems that work together well, I think, is the goal. Seems like, well, and we are the last 2 minutes, and I always like to sort of ask at the end, something that I didn't ask you, something that you want to share, that you want to leave all of us with, that we would feel remiss not sharing. So. Oh
my gosh, asking me to be profound in the last moment. I don't know that I can rise to that challenge. I guess, well, something you touched on is to just be your authentic self. Somebody asked me once in a class, what's the best thing I can do to move ahead this climate thing? And my answer was, do where your passion and your skills go, where your passion and your skills intersect. That's where you'll be most effective for everyone. And I thought that was
thank you so obvious. Much. Yeah.
Oh, and he said it really helped him. I was like, okay.
Well, it is profound in the very, human humble way, because I think people either choose very cerebral or very emotional. I think that those two things can be married pretty successful. Of course, there is a challenge for those of us who are passionate about so many things. That, yeah.
All right.
But that's why we talk to people who know a lot. So, and thank you so much. I could have another hour of conversation because there are so many other things that I wanted to would love to touch on, and very interesting. I hope to stay in touch. I hope we have another conversation about the whole educational system and how we can teach the right thing in the right way to the right audience. I think that's important. So maybe we can, do a little bit of a panel that we talked about, talk about adult education versus teenage education, which is, sort of different and the same. So,
I would enjoy that.
It's been a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you for
All right.
inviting me.
Thank you. And if you can stay actually for a couple minutes, and thank you everybody for tuning in. I hope you learned a lot, and we'll see you next Friday here at 12 o'clock live. Thank you so much for joining In the Know, and our wonderful people who are contributed to climate change stopping climate change. Thank you so much. See you next Friday.